Think back for just a second to sitting in your middle school history class. You can probably still remember the smell of those heavy old textbooks, right? The scratch of the chalk on the board and that absolute rock-solid certainty you felt that everything you were being taught was 100% true. I mean, we all sat there, diligently memorizing dates and names, completely trusting that our curriculum was giving us the unvarnished facts. But what if I told you that some of the most foundational stories we celebrate in American history are, well, completely fabricated? And look, we aren't talking about small, harmless little details here. We're talking about massive, culturally defining narratives that have been polished, packaged, and handed down for generations. Why? To protect a very specific national identity.
So what if your history textbook just flat out lied? Okay, let's really dive into this. In this explainer, we aren't just going to list off a bunch of dry, disconnected facts. No, we're going to look at history the way it was always meant to be understood, as a deeply human story. We're going to uncover the compelling narratives, the hidden motives, and the highly calculated reasons behind why these historical lies were created in the very first place.
Section 1. The Great Fabricators. Washington, Columbus, and the men who made them. Let's kick things off with two of the most massive myths taught to almost every kid before they can even read a full chapter book. We're looking at the ultimate symbol of American honesty, George Washington, and the supposedly brilliant scientific mind of Christopher Columbus, the cherry tree and the flat earth. Two perfect American heroes and two complete fictions. You definitely know the textbook fables. The story goes that a 6-year-old George Washington gets a brand new hatchet, chops down his dad's prized cherry tree, and when he's confronted, he confesses immediately saying, "I cannot tell a lie," because, his virtue is just that pure. Then you've got Christopher Columbus in 1492, courageously sailing off into the unknown, single-handedly defying a whole crowd of ignorant scholars who were absolutely certain he was going to sail right off the edge of a flat earth. They are beautiful, inspiring stories, and they are completely, utterly made up.
Here's the thing. There was actually no cherry tree. There was no hatchet. That entire event was invented out of thin air in 1799 by an author named Mason Locke Weems. He basically wanted to sell biographies to a grieving public right after Washington's death, so he painted him as a literal saint. And the flat earth debate? That was completely invented in 1828 by the author Washington Irving. He just wanted to make his biography of Columbus way more dramatic and paint him as this flawless hero of reason. Both of these myths were fabricated by 19th century authors trying to manufacture a secular mythology. They were writing for a young nation that desperately needed legendary figures to bind a totally fractured public together. The stark historical reality was buried entirely beneath these myths. First off, Washington wasn't a flawless icon of pure honesty. He was a deeply complex, incredibly wealthy plantation owner who held enslaved people. Second, in 1492, literally every educated person in Europe already knew the Earth was a sphere. To put that into perspective, the ancient Greeks had proven it 2,000 years prior. The reality of Columbus is that he was actually terrible at math. Spanish geographers rejected his proposal because he calculated the Earth to be way smaller than it actually is. If the Americas hadn't been sitting there blocking his path to Asia by sheer geographic luck, Columbus and his crew would have starved to death in the middle of the ocean.
Section 2. The Brilliant Strategist. The true story of Rosa Parks.
If you think rewriting a president's childhood or a navigator's math skills is a big deal, just wait until you see how history rewrote one of America's most famous civil rights icons. The textbook myth frames Rosa Parks as this quiet, demure, tired elderly seamstress who just accidentally sparked a civil rights movement because she was too exhausted after a long day of work to give up her seat. It frames her actions as this totally spontaneous spark. But honestly, reducing Rosa Parks to a tired old lady who just happened to sit down is a massive insult to her legacy. She was absolutely not a passive bystander.
The actual truth is a radically different timeline. Years prior to the boycott, Parks was a seasoned, highly trained political activist. She traveled to the Highlander Folk School, which was a notorious training ground for civil rights organizers. For an entire year before the incident, the Women's Political Council had been actively planning a bus boycott. So on the day of her arrest, she wasn't just tired. Her refusal to move was a highly calculated act of civil disobedience. She served as the perfect federal test case they had been actively looking for, and within just hours of her arrest, they mobilized, printing over 35,000 flyers to launch the boycott. It wasn't an accident. She was executing a brilliant, strategic masterclass.
So it begs the question, why the lie? Well, a radical, highly organized black woman actively dismantling institutional racism was frankly terrifying to the mid-century American establishment. It was much safer and far more digestible for white audiences at the time to strip her of her agency.
They framed her as an unthreatening woman who just wanted to rest her feet. By doing that, they isolated this systemic critique, making it look like a harmless, spontaneous accident rather than the brilliant, organized strategy it actually was.
Section 3. The democracy illusion. Engineering the republic.
Now we're going to pivot to the structural myths of the United States government itself and that patriotic bedrock we are all taught from birth, the idea of a pure democracy. But look at this quote right here. The Founding Fathers were actively terrified of a pure democracy. We're always taught that the founders designed a system where the voice of the majority rules. But if you actually go back and look at the notes from the Constitutional Convention of 1787, men like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison viewed pure democracy as mob rule. Keep in mind they were part of the wealthy, land-owning colonial elite, and they had just witnessed working-class uprisings like Shays' Rebellion, where farmers literally picked up weapons to protest their farms being seized for debts.
Because of that fear, they intentionally engineered a system filled with roadblocks to fragment the power of the majority. Take a look at this. The US Senate was designed so that a tiny state has the exact same power as a massive state. And originally, senators weren't even voted on by the public at all. They were chosen by state legislatures. And the Electoral College? That was designed specifically as a buffer to override the popular vote if the elites felt the public made a bad choice.
The reality is that the foundational architecture of the system was built as an anti-democratic fortress. It was explicitly designed to protect the property of the few from the hands of the many, essentially stopping the regular, everyday public from voting to redistribute wealth and property.
Section 4. The Uneasy Alliance. The Real 1621 Feast.
This brings us to the ultimate American origin story of unity, the Thanksgiving fantasy. Every November, you see schools putting on these plays showing pilgrims and Native Americans sitting down in perfect, peaceful harmony. But the actual timeline is pure fiction. The friendship we are all taught about was actually the Wampanoag Geopolitical Alliance. It was a tense military contract formed by the Wampanoag leader Massasoit. You see, his people had just been absolutely devastated by diseases brought by previous European explorers, and they were facing a major threat from a rival tribe called the Narragansett. They allied with the Pilgrims purely for survival and military protection. It was a calculated, desperate political alliance, not a friendly cross-cultural potluck.
And what about that famous feast in 1621? Get this, the Wampanoag weren't even formally invited. The volatile reality of that day is that the Pilgrims were firing off weapons to celebrate their harvest, which heavily alarmed the Wampanoag. Massasoit showed up with 90 armed men because they literally thought a war was starting. Once they realized it wasn't, they stuck around simply to monitor the situation. So yeah, they ate, but it was highly uneasy. This volatile dynamic led to a tragic aftermath that our textbooks always seem to conveniently leave out. Step 1, within a single generation, that fragile peace completely dissolves. Step 2, the Pilgrims' descendants launch a brutal war of extermination against the Wampanoag people, which becomes known as King Philip's War, one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in American history. So, step 3, how did we actually get the holiday? Well, jump forward to the mid-19th century, right during the absolute chaos of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln fabricated the holiday as a massive PR campaign to manufacture a sense of long-standing national unity that, quite frankly, never actually existed.
Section 5. Who tells the story? The power of historical PR.
We've unpacked a whole lot today, and it brings us to a vital conclusion about the immense power of historical PR. History is not just a static list of names and dates for you to memorize. It is an active, ongoing struggle over the narrative. It's a fight over who gets to tell the story. It is wild to think about how much of what we accept as absolute fact is just carefully crafted public relations from the past, designed to make us feel better about our present. But when you look beneath those curated myths, the real story, the actual messy, complicated human story, is always infinitely more complex and fascinating than anything you'll ever find in a sanitized school textbook. So, I'll leave you with this. If these foundational stories were rewritten for our comfort, what else in your textbook is a carefully curated PR campaign? History is out there waiting to be explored, questioned, and truly understood. If this explainer changed how you think about the stories you were told growing up, I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts. Which of these historical realities surprised you the most? Thanks for joining me on this one, and keep questioning the narrative.